We're going to take us down the road of climate technology and competition, and not only what it means out there, but what it means here at home in Oregon. So take it away.
Dave, do you want these mics on? We're good.
Great. Do you want me to kick off?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Well, thank you, Tim, for that introduction, and again for the invitation to be here, and to all of you for your interest in climate policy in Oregon, but also at the national and international levels. But as you can tell, we're keeping things conversational today. We figured, this is a very, complex topic, and Tim and I come at it from different perspectives, but are really excited to share with you, what we see as the opportunities and challenges at, the international, federal, and then where we spend most of our time, which is at the state level. So maybe before diving in, I'll just share a little bit more about my background and kind of how I got to this work. As Tim shared, I went to Lewis and Clark College, spent time at the federal level, and have been in Oregon working at OEC for the last 4 years. I want to share a little bit about how I came here, because I do think it very much informs my perspective on this question of, how do international agreements like COP28, how do trade policies, how do national policies, and then state level action all fit together. So I, again, started, or before I started my career, was at Lewis and Clark College studying international affairs. And was drawn to that because I saw opportunity for international agreement and cooperation and diplomacy to help advance progress on a global scale. I actually looked at, how, my thesis is on, how did Germany over the course of 5 decades manage to sustain progressive climate and sustainable policymaking despite all, changing political dynamics. And I looked at multilateral agreements. I looked at the public pressure that was put on the government. I looked at the type of electoral systems that this country had, and was still left with a lot of questions. So I went to Washington, D.C. I started working for Senator Wyden specifically on federal policy issues, but again, kept being drawn to what I view as really the crisis of our time, which is climate change, which is what led me to work at NRDC, where I had the chance to understand both the opportunity of international agreements like COP. I started there just after the 2015 Paris Accord, saw a lot of opportunity there, and then shortly after that saw a change in our federal administration in a way that set us back pretty significantly. So you're seeing a trend, right? I saw opportunity, I saw the limitations, I saw the chance to help, build on public and international agreements like COP28 through national progress. But really it was the change in administration and what I saw as a really important need and opportunity to advance proactive, meaningful policy solutions to the climate crisis at the state level that drove me to come back home to Oregon and join OEC, where I've been really happy to work with partners like Tim and Oregon Business for Climate to secure really meaningful climate policy victories over the last few years. So we'll get into more of all of that, but just wanted to share some context in terms of how I got here and how I think about this. I'll pass it over to Tim.
Thanks, Nora. And we're all, by the way, very lucky that she decided to come back here, because Nora is a huge asset in Oregon's work on addressing climate change. You're not going to get, she mentioned we come at this from different perspectives, but you're not going to get a debate here, because we are very aligned. We are on the same phone calls 2 or 3 times a week, and we work together very, very closely. So, but I bring more of a business focus and perspective, and Nora brings a broad perspective. So my background and what brought me here, I guess I'll go back to my formal background is in economics in college, and also a business degree. And with that, I worked in the private sector for 15 years or so, and then decided that I wanted to have a positive impact with my work, so I decided to shift into what we called sustainability at the time. That's 20 years ago. And over time, that has evolved more and more toward a focus on addressing climate change, because I see that as our two biggest issues on the planet. I'd say climate change and equity are, to me, the two biggest challenges we face. So happy to be working on climate change. My exposure sort of broadened on that significantly when I decided to treat myself to go to the Paris climate discussions, the COP, I guess that'd be COP 20 maybe, about 8 years ago, and was there for the climate agreements and to watch that process and see how that all unfolded. We didn't get everything we wanted in the Paris agreements, but we got some pretty good goals set. And we'll talk more about the role of those goals and the importance of those. Anyway, that has been sort of my marker on the international level, but most of my work is at the state level as well, just an observer of what's going on. Of course, working at the state level, we are very engaged with what is happening at the national level with the Inflation Reduction Act and other opportunities, and then bringing that down to Oregon. So looking forward to getting into this conversation and then hearing questions from you all. So why don't I'll ask the first question. How about that? Okay. So we're going to go back and forth here asking each other questions. The first one, and thanks Tim for some guidance on these questions too. So Nora, what would you say do recent international commitments like the historic COP28 mean for climate progress and global cooperation? What does it mean for international cooperation and collaboration and the potential for countries like the US and China to prioritize their own economic interests through trade protectionism?
Some small questions.
Yeah.
I'm going to quickly go back to I recognize this doesn't seem relevant, but my thesis, right? I talked about Lewis and Clark College. So I was looking at, what does enable a country like the United States, I was specifically studying Germany, to enact ambitious climate and environmental policy protections. I did not find that it was international agreements, that it was that multilateral cooperation that really pushes a country. But my views on that have evolved, and in part, I think Paris was a big turning point. But specifically, the most recent COP28 and the conversations that have happened since Paris, I see as being really significant to putting major leaders like the United States, like China, on task, right? These are global conversations and commitments that are publicly made at the international level to what a given country is going to do in its taking responsibility to address climate change. The most recent COP28 I mentioned being significant because this was really the first time that parties to the Paris Agreement agreed to phase out fossil fuels. And that feels pretty sad, I think, to consider that for as long as we have understood the need to address man-made climate change and rein in the fossil fuels that are leading to the devastating climate impacts we're already experiencing in Oregon, but really around the world, that this was the first time that we've had that level of commitment. But it is really significant, and it is especially important as we're considering what are called the nationally determined contributions. So what a given country has agreed to in terms of their own emissions reductions and their responsibility for reining in emissions, driving climate change. So I think it's really important to have that global cooperation, have that public commitment to reducing climate emissions. And also, I really appreciate this conversation. I didn't even realize, Tim, that you were able to be in Paris. So
I snuck in. It's really easy to sneak in there.
I think in addition to the public commitments, those types of international events are really important for conversations, information sharing for those, not representing a given government, but the individuals, the businesses, industries, nonprofit organizations that are there, all working together to figure out how are we going to collectively solve this global issue. So I think there is a lot of opportunity, but it does come down to what actions is a country actually taking to rein in fossil fuels. Just saying that you're going to reduce emissions by 45% by 2030 or whatever you have agreed to in your NDC isn't enough, clearly. So that's where I think, public pressure, organizations like ours, constituents, really holding their governments to account in terms of how are you going to address this problem, how are you going to achieve these emissions reductions is really important. And we'll get into that a bit later in terms of where we've seen progress at the national level as well as the state level and how that feeds into these international agreements. To the trade question, I think there is both opportunity and challenge, right? If we are going to effectively, triple investments in renewables, we are going to need technologies. We're going to need innovation, and that will necessitate international cooperation. We don't have every single piece of the supply chain that we might need for to effectively boost, solar and renewables to the extent that we know we need to. We also, may not be leading in a given industry, right? We have the continued need for information sharing that trade can help facilitate, but there will be challenges, right? This is becoming, in recognizing in these international agreements the need to accelerate the transition to a clean energy economy. I think there's a healthy competition that is supported through that. And that does have, a risk in terms of backfiring. A country like the United States may choose to impose solar tariffs, right? As we saw the Trump administration do back in 2018. That was intended to boost our domestic solar manufacturing, but it actually ended up raising costs and hurting our ability in the short term to help accelerate and implement those types of technologies here in the United States. So I think that's a good example of where trade protectionism can pose a risk and potentially, derail or slow down our progress. And that's where we have to be, I think, flexible and adapt based on the needs. We can continue growing our local economy or our domestic economy. But we need to consider how trade will help facilitate and make sure that we are staying on track to achieve our emissions reductions. But very interested in your take.
Yeah, right.
Tim.
And we're gonna both answer each question, but one of us is gonna start. So I'll just follow on that. Broadly, totally agree that these international meetings and commitments are critical. At the same time, they don't do the job. So agree that they're critical. They set the goal. They define a marker, and they also define, at least what Paris did was it said, okay, we're going to measure, how are we going to measure this? How often are we going to measure this? What's our protocol for checking whether we're on track? So that's great. You can't, as in management, you would say if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So that's powerful, but and it's a binding treaty in a sense, but it really doesn't enforce very much. So that's the downside. And our current international structure is also the way the UN works is anyone who's at the COP, any country can veto the agreement. So everyone has to be on board, which makes for pretty soft, watered down agreements. Not that I'm advocating for some other global structure, but that's a challenge to get strong agreements out of it. The global goals also give us a framework then to measure against at a global level and to then apply the evolving science. So we know more than we did back in Paris. We know more about the tipping points and knock-on effects as we warm the planet. Unfortunately, that also triggers things that will warm the planet more as the global north melts and releases more methane, for example, or as the ice sheet melts and we absorb more heat into the water. those kinds of things, those weren't fully baked in, at least to the questions I asked in Paris, those weren't really baked into our carbon budget very well in 2015. So those are getting absorbed or built in more, and we're getting clearer on the goals and how important it is to address this in a timely manner. So our 2-degree goal that we took in Paris with a 1.5 degree aspiration, I think has gotten stronger to be a 1.5 degree target, although we're likely to surpass that, but it gives us something to hold ourselves to. But it's not firm enough, in my opinion. So that's my take, and I think you covered the trade part of that. We'll maybe touch on that more.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, I think your point around how these agreements actually come together is a really important one. It does, as you said, lead to, lesser commitments than we might like or expect to see. And it is really significant in that it's not just consensus, it really is, the entirety of the parties involved. So appreciate you raising that. So we've touched on a bit in terms of the, opportunities and limitations of these types of multilateral agreements. And as you've picked up on, right, we see some limitations, and we recognize to help address those, there needs to be progress and accountability and meaningful policy action by the countries involved. So Tim, I'd love for you to kick us off with answering what you think the role of state and national governments should be in this transition.
Yeah, and I'll start with national, and then we'll get into state maybe later. And without getting into the US yet, I would just say broadly, given that we don't have an enforceable international framework to address climate change, we don't have really strong international markets to trade carbon or have other solutions. We have those at a sort of a subnational level, but we don't have it internationally. That means that the national efforts are critical for us to address climate change. We have a global framework, but we don't have global enforceability or global structure, so the national work is absolutely essential. And that's where these nationally developed contributions, the NDCs that Nora mentioned, are our way of managing this. We have a commitment by each country, and then we can check against that commitment. So the whole effort right now is built on individual national efforts, and that's critical. It allows, doing it at a national level allows countries to address their local sort of pie chart of emissions and what are their biggest emissions areas and what are the strategies that they can use in their social and political context to address those. What are their resources? What technologies or financial resources do they have to direct at that? How can they do that while balancing needs of their citizenry? So addressing this at a national level is critical because you can tailor these solutions and meet commitments. And of course, those solutions are very different whether you're in a developed country or a developing country. So those are all critical to take it down to a national level. That's my view, and then we can get into US and IRA later.
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, I mean, I think building on what you said, Tim, and I fully agree with, right? The role of national and state governments is putting teeth to these agreements, really nailing down, okay, how are we going to achieve these emissions reductions that we've committed to on the national or international stage? So that means, regulations, ramping down pollution from our top emitting sectors in a way that, supports job creation. It helps incentivize innovation and technological advancement. It creates jobs, right? The national or federal government has a really important role to play in ensuring that, as we are ramping down emissions, we are doing so in a way that supports an equitable transition. It supports family wage job creation. It helps communities that have been, historically reliant on fossil fuels for their economies and benefiting from this transition to a new clean energy economy. I think that likewise, right, we've had, decades of of subsidies for the fossil fuels that are causing climate change and causing the impacts that we are experiencing. And so if we think about, with the role of state and national governments, there's also a role to play in investments and making sure that we are leveling the playing field, so to speak, in terms of making sure that we are able to achieve this rapid acceleration to renewables. We've had technologies like wind and solar available, or even efficient heat pumps, right? The alternative to gas-powered appliances for decades. But it really has only been in the past 5 or 10 years that we've seen huge growth in those sectors, in part because they have become cheaper. So thinking about both regulation, right, the stick, but also the carrots and how those fit together to stay on track to achieve our emissions reductions, but also do so in a way that supports, equitable access to this new clean energy economy. So would love to dig in more in terms of both the state and the federal government's role. We've both been paying a lot of attention in recent years to actions taken by the federal administration. So would love, Tim, for you to kick us off with how the United States is positioning itself to lead in the global clean energy economy.
I would say, at least in the current administration, we've positioned ourselves to lead. We've taken big steps to lead in that primarily through the Inflation Reduction Act. That is a huge step forward in this work, and it emphasizes or recognizes that we've sort of taken a step back on our manufacturing capability and manufacturing capacity, so it invests in manufacturing, specifically around the clean technologies that we need to address climate change. It addresses supply chain gaps with significant funding in that. The goal of the Inflation Reduction Act, to address or to achieve a 40 or 50% reduction of our emissions by 2030 or so, is on track with where we need to be with the global goals to reduce our emissions. So it sets a marker and it sets funding. And it also is, as our own Senator Wyden likes to say, it's really mostly about carrots and not about sticks. It's about incentives, it's about tax credits, it's about funding the solutions that we need. So it's, I think we position ourselves very well to be a leader in this. So state policies to me federal policies absolutely critical in doing this. IRA invests in renewable energy, clean technologies, electric vehicles, puts money into all those solutions, including charging infrastructure. It also did include some protectionism for those of you who are thinking about the trade aspects of this. IRA does emphasize US-built technologies. It emphasizes EVs that have local minerals and local content. So you get a higher incentive if you buy an EV that has these local content requirements met versus if you just buy any EV, for example. So there is protectionism built in to a certain extent, and that ruffled some feathers internationally when IRA came out. But I think it balances the need for building our own economy around this work and leading on it, with also still being able to tap global supply chains when we need to. So that's my take. I think we're positioning ourselves well, the US is, to lead on this. That positioning is also fragile, vulnerable to a change in our administration or our direction and our philosophy. Y'all know what I'm saying. So I'll hand it to you, Nora. What do you think is the US's role?
I think I spoke to, at a high level, my perspective in terms of the role, and I couldn't agree more. I think as of right now, we're seeing really tremendous leadership in making sure that we are positioning ourselves to be at the forefront of this global transition to a clean energy future. And as you said, that is not for certain that those incentives will remain. And I think even if they do, there is a lot of uncertainty in terms of the effectiveness of incentives alone, right? Well, first I'll take a step back and just maybe add a fine point to the scale of this opportunity that Tim mentioned under the Inflation Reduction Act. I like to joke it's my favorite law. It's also my favorite happy hour conversation, my party talk. All my friends are tired of hearing me talk about it. But I want to talk about it more because it is so important, and it's important at a systemic level in terms of the scale of the investments in renewables, as Tim was mentioning, but also at a household level, because there are really significant incentives for individuals and households to help make important improvements to your home or upgrade your vehicle. So again, just to put a fine point in it, this is a $370 billion investment in clean energy and climate. That is really the minimum because the majority of the investments in the Inflation Reduction Act are uncapped tax credits. So that means there's no limit to how much the government will award. But that also means it's really on businesses, it's on renewable developers, it's on individual households to make themselves aware of these incentives, to avail themselves of them, to apply for them. Right, so that 40 to 50% emissions reduction that Tim mentioned that is projected with successful implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act really is dependent on what we do over the next 5 or so years to maximize and implement those investments. Likewise, even with the billions of dollars available for renewables, for example, we know that there are also important barriers that we have to address, like transmission, right? Siting, permitting. So again, those are all policy changes rather than simply incentives that will enable us to really leverage the full potential of these carrots. So yeah, I mean, I think this is just a huge turn in terms of the United States demonstrating its commitment and really positioning on a global level that this is going to be a huge part of our economy. This is something that we are, putting dollars to, really significant dollars to make sure that we are at the forefront, that we are creating electric vehicles in the United States, that we are creating in-demand technologies like heat pumps domestically, because we know and recognize that those technologies will only be in increasing demand as the entire world transitions to this clean energy future. So yes, as of right now, positioning well, but there's more to do and limitations with incentives alone, and yeah, questions around the long-term nature of these investments.
So how about this one? Oh, that's me to ask you. Yes, okay. So with all that then, so Nora, what is Oregon's role relative to that?
Great, thanks, Tim. Okay, so I guess I was already hitting on this a bit. I think Oregon and other states have such an important role, right? It's incredible that we were able to, or that the federal government, that Congress was able to pass this sweeping climate package, the Inflation Reduction Act. They were only able to do so through what's called the budget reconciliation process, right? They didn't have to, they weren't held to their usual majority requirements to get it across. It was just a simple majority, right? So they needed Senator Manchin, right? It was very, very slim margins. We shouldn't expect it to happen again anytime soon. And I think it's telling in terms of, and that's why, because they had to go through this budget reconciliation process, that's why this is in pretty much all carrots and not the sticks and regulations that we know are equally as important to accelerating this transition and supporting and driving innovation. So with that, that means that states have that even more important role to play to make sure that we are not only proactively leveraging these investments, but also complementing them through regulations that can ensure that we are driving down emissions at the pace and scale necessary, in line with the best available science, in line with our international agreements. And I think likewise, there's a really important opportunity with that. We're thinking, the federal government, right, is thinking about how can we accelerate and grow our domestic clean energy economy. We're thinking about how can we grow our Oregon's clean energy economy? How can we, have a healthy competition with other states to make sure that as manufacturers of solar panels or offshore wind parts and components are looking to set up shop, that they're looking to come to Oregon, so that we are doing everything we can to lead nationally, but also internationally in this transition. So that really does come down to state leadership. What are we doing to contribute to the incentives stack, for a given clean energy technology company or manufacturer, so that they see Oregon as an attractive place to expand or set up shop. But then likewise, right, in the absence of those sticks, we as a state have a vital role to play in making sure that we are staying on track. So I mentioned at the top, we've been so lucky and excited to see some really, really incredible progress at the state level in recent years. When I started at OEC in March 2020, the state was off track to achieve its even then outdated climate pollution reduction targets by 20%, which was highly discouraging. I had not lived in my home state for many years at that point, so to come home and really recognize just how far off track we were was incredibly disheartening and just really disappointing as an Oregonian. And as of last year, the state, thanks to the recent policies that the legislature and our former Governor Brown helped get into place, we were on track to achieve our emissions reduction targets of 45% below 1990 levels by 2035. That's still not, quite in line with the ambition that we know we need to effectively do our part and take our share of the responsibility in addressing climate change, but it is huge, huge progress. There is a caveat there. We've had some setbacks, which maybe Tim might want to talk about or not. But all's to say, it is thanks to our recent policies that we can say, we are doing our part. We are going to make sure that in addition to these incentives, we are driving down emissions through regulation, supporting job creation, and supporting communities in that transition as we do so. So I'll pause there. I feel like I've been talking for an hour at this point, but Tim, I would love your thoughts on this question.
And we want to reserve time for questions as well. So we'll go pretty quickly here. I think Oregon's role is, we work mostly on Oregon's opportunity here, so we think Oregon's role is critical. Oregon has the opportunity to be a leader, as does Washington. California is a leader, clearly, but we have an opportunity to be an example to other states. There are a lot of states who are making good progress, but there are a lot of states who are way behind us, and so to the extent that we can be a leader, that's an important role. Just to bring some of those big numbers, Nora mentioned about $370 billion for the Inflation Reduction Act at a national level, and Goldman Sachs looks at that and says, as Nora noted, when you grow that with the investment tax credits and all the private capital that can flow in due to the National Inflation Reduction Act, that grows that thing to like $1.3 trillion. Oregon's share of $1.3 trillion is like $35 billion of activity in Oregon, which is a really huge opportunity for our economy. Even if you just look at the most base level math, $370 billion, we're 1.28% of the US population. That means just on straight math, we should have a $4.7 billion opportunity from the Inflation Reduction Act. That's really big for a state the size of Oregon. And the Rocky Mountain Institute says that's more like $8 billion. So whether it's 4.7 or 8 or $35 billion, it's a big opportunity in Oregon. Oregon has a role to deploy those dollars and do everything we can to make ourselves a leader in how you use those dollars and clean up our economy. we, I would say, 20 years ago, were a recognized leader. Oregon was one of the top states in addressing this. We lost some ground. As Nora mentioned, we were behind, but now we've gained back some ground. We also work across the West Coast, so collaborating with California and Washington. So there's an opportunity there for that whole West Coast economy to lead. So Oregon has an important role in that. And taking it down to the micro level, this is an opportunity for our companies, right? So companies in Oregon, as we access these dollars and access these markets, we can innovate and create manufacturing and other technologies, software, et cetera, here that can address markets all over the world. So it's an opportunity for us in addition to having an important role in leadership. On the other hand, Oregon is a great example of the challenge in addressing this. We had, as Nora mentioned, some policies that put us on path to meeting our somewhat outdated but important climate goals. Now, one of those big programs, the Climate Protection Plan, which was instituted by the Department of Environmental Quality following on Governor Brown's executive order, that program is now on hold. And that is one of the two biggest wedges we have. If you look at our emissions and our need to decline those emissions, one big wedge is our policy to have 100% clean electricity grid. The other big wedge is our Climate Protection Plan. Well, that plan is now invalid. We're going to go about reinstating that plan over the next year. So you'll see a lot of local conversation about that, how to reinstate that thing to make it as strong as it was when it was first enacted 3 years ago, two years ago. So just to bring it back into that whole international, national, state context, Oregon is a great example of how we have great ambition, but we also struggle to enact policies that actually address climate change at the speed and scale that we need to. And even this week, right now in Salem, there are conversations happening where the trade-offs are being addressed about the urgent needs in our state for our folks to have healthy situations, housing, education, all the services we need to take care of folks, and the challenge of balancing that with or investing enough in addressing climate change. That's happening right now. We have the lack of resources to do both. So, or at least that's the current perspective. I would suggest that those investments can actually pay for themselves and create opportunities, but that's not always the way the conversation goes. So Oregon's role, I think, is a great example and a great challenge in meeting this. I'll pause there.
We could clearly
Talk forever.
talk forever. We want to make sure we have time to hear from you all. So we'll hand it back to you, Tim.
Sure, and we've got a question back there, but I have the mic, so I get to ask a question. I think that there's no arguing that one of the most exciting things that happened over maybe the last 10 years was the rise of the youth climate movement. And seeing a very, very powerful group of young people doing things that they didn't wait for our permission for. Yet this is also a generation that oftentimes is referred to as Generation Dread, because of climate anxiety and not having children, and is also, if not suspicious, skeptical of government solutions to large-scale problems. So I'm curious, in the work that you two are doing, what kinds of strategies are you using to engage and reconcile the top-down with the bottom-up, not just with the youth climate movement, but I think that the indigenous movement of looking at traditional ecologic knowledge in the mix of other technocratic solutions? What do you see happening, and is there a way to bring more people into something, because the end game truly is trying to save our planet?
Want to start on that? Yeah, okay. I'll take a first crack at that. Although I'm less familiar with, or I do less work connecting to the youth movement, I would say that the conversation around addressing climate change has, very, very thankful to say, it is broadened beyond what, you know, a 1980s or 1990s environmentalist perspective was largely a white, wealthy perspective on addressing climate change. In Oregon over the last 5 years, I would say that has broadened considerably. The shared power has changed a lot, and actually we owe a lot of our recent progress to the really strong involvement of BIPOC communities, BIPOC-led organizations, community-based organizations that have brought a voice into the conversation of the folks who are impacted most, impacted first and worst, as you'll hear, by climate change. So those voices are much stronger now, or have, I guess, captured and own the power that those voices should have in the conversation. So that's helped us address this challenge much more effectively than in previous years. We wouldn't have our 100% clean power bill without the strength of a much broader community bringing those policies to bear. So youth, great question, and maybe Nora will have some insights about how we brought in the youth conversation.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that, Tim. And I wouldn't even say it's just this generation, right? I also grew up with climate, it has been around for a while, right? And so I think helping to grow that movement, and as Tim said, bring those voices into the conversation, but also give them reason for hope is really, really important. Some ways that we have been doing that, I mean, Tim mentioned just the growing and more inclusive nature of, I would say, like the broader environmental or climate community in Oregon. Part of that is advocating for more transparent and inclusive decision-making processes, right? So, state rulemakings, not really inherently a very open process that, general constituents know how to get engaged in. Part of what we have been advocating for is more information about how to join and participate in rulemakings, how youth can make their voices heard. Last year in the 2023 legislative session, we effectively secured a new youth seat on the Oregon Climate Action Commission. So really trying to be intentional about integrating and having formal representation in addition to supporting more transparent and inclusive decision-making processes, I think is really important to empowering youth and other constituencies to engage and feel heard. The Senate, Oregon Senate Energy and Environment Committee also now has standalone time specifically to hear from youth voices during their committee meetings. So those are, I think, important steps. And I see it as our role to uplift, what we were just talking about in terms of here are the emissions reductions that we are seeing from these systemic solutions to the climate crisis, so that there is that optimism, because we are feeling it. We are seeing this progress, but with everything going on in the world, it's sometimes hard to glean those glimmers of hope. So I think, all of the above.
Yeah, and I'll just add that I have 3 daughters who are in that generation dread, and there's a concern and a challenge and a question there. And a lot of these talks end with some platitudes about, well, if we just drive less and turn off the lights, everything will be fine. And I'm not in that space. This is a really critical challenge. It's going to be very hard. And you asked about pessimism or optimism. It's going to, in my view, it's going to get worse before it gets better. But I think that doesn't need to cause paralysis for an audience, certainly not this one, because y'all are big thinkers, but some audiences get paralysis from that. And I think that's a concern that, youth faces that and comes away with some dread and some non-action in some cases. But really, we have to act so that it doesn't get way worse. It's going to get worse, but it could get way, way, way worse. So we need to work really hard so it doesn't get way, way, way worse. That's the optimism, is let's do all we can to make it, to make the recovery as fast as it can be. By the way, on the just a data point or anecdote with respect to the importance of youth voices, Nora and I were both speaking with a person who's in the governor's office recently, and the example that person cited from a legislature 2 or 3 years ago was a time when a youth voice was speaking, and how powerful that was to the legislators who were listening to this young person speak, and how disparate that was then when someone from a fossil fuel company got up and spoke. And everyone really saw the stark difference of what we were hearing from the youth voice versus the fossil industry voice. So it's powerful.
Having worked on the green jobs approach over 20 years and making peace between labor and environmentalists, which used to be a very antagonistic, I'd like to just get down to the specific issues that we face in Oregon to deal with some of these issues about our carbon problems. One is, how do you feel about the removal of hydroelectric dams? Number two, where's the environmental movement on nuclear power as far as with the new technologies that are available? And number three, I've looked at a number of input-output analysis on EVs, and there's a very strong argument that EVs are worse for the environment because of the need for rare earth materials and other exotic elements going into them versus, say, hybrids and hydrogen cars. And also raising all the issues that people are facing who own EVs, finding that cold weather significantly removes their range, and that there isn't the infrastructure, and there needs to be a tremendous infrastructure if you're taking long trips. And I could go on. How do we, as a practical matter in Oregon, address those issues?
Lots of questions.
Yeah. Do you want to take any of those, or? I've got an answer to a couple, but do you have a nuclear or dams answer?
I'm happy to maybe jump in holistically. There's a lot of really great questions in there, and I think what's at the heart of all of those is weighing trade-offs, right? And I think speaking to the need to think holistically around the solutions that we know are needed to address the climate crisis. I do think it's important to remind ourselves constantly that if we are going to achieve what science says is necessary to avoid catastrophic, irreversible climate impacts, we need to have our emissions by 2030, and we have a few years to do that. At the same time, we have to consider, all of the technologies that are available, and weigh, both, costs and impacts to communities and opportunities in the near term to drive those needed emissions reductions by the end of this decade and then beyond. So I think, hydro is a really important example and very relevant, of course, especially in the Pacific Northwest, given that is where the majority of our renewables at this point come from. And we have also seen over the decades the impacts that our existing hydro has had on our salmon populations, on the existing ecosystems, and the tribal communities that rely on those ecosystems for their culture and way of life. So I think that that is something that is very, very prominent as we're thinking about how are we going to achieve our 100% clean electricity law? How are we going to do so equitably in a way that considers and prioritizes communities on the front lines of climate change, including Oregon tribes? And how are we going to accelerate the transition and build out of other renewables like wind and solar? I think, you mentioned labor, right? We're considering offshore wind off the coast of Oregon. There's a bill moving through the legislature right now that sets a roadmap for community engagement and process around that, as well as strong labor standards, so that if and when offshore wind is realized, it is providing prevailing benefits for the workers that will be building out those renewable systems. So I'm going to pause there because there were so many great questions, and I know Tim has responses as well.
Yeah, I'll just sort of add to that or align with that. If you accept that climate change is a global challenge that has knock-on effects that we shudder to imagine, then one way to approach these trade-offs is to say, okay, there's a graph, there's a line that we need to follow. There's an emissions reduction that we need to achieve. Have to. Otherwise, there's not going to be any conversation about whether your EV is better than your other EV, right? Everything is done. So if that has to be achieved, how do you achieve it with the least impact on other systems? Because there's no math that I know of that says this many tons of carbon is better or worse than this many tons of tailings going into a river. There's no direct conversion of those things, so you can't sort of optimize that equation. To me, you have to say, we have to meet these carbon reductions, now let's minimize those other impacts. That goes to the nuclear question, it goes to dams, and it goes to EVs. And when you hear these studies or these challenges, I would say, avoid time warp conversations where someone says, hey, these batteries we have today have problems. Well, the batteries we have today aren't the batteries we're going to have forever. So don't get stuck in today's challenge and be stuck saying EVs are a problem. No, EVs are a solution. EVs have to get better. And that goes to the infrastructure and the charging and all these. I drive an EV, and it's really frustrating when you get halfway to Bend and you're trying to figure out how to charge the dang thing. That doesn't mean EV is not a good solution. That means we need to work harder on the infrastructure and get the whole thing solved. The Inflation Reduction Act tries to do that, and there are other requirements that try to do that. So, and I would always caution, where are those information bits coming from? I starkly remember when Priuses first came out, you heard a lot of data about, well, your Prius is worse than my Hummer because the Prius has a battery and it has, it's going to leak content when you, have the end of life of that Prius. Well, I don't think that was ever true, and you have to consider where that argument came from when trying to digest this information. So.
I want to kind of tamp on to Lance's question, but more from the policy end. So in the COP conversations, are they talking about the kind of rare earth, the impact of the kind of communities that we're getting the rare earth metals and ores from, and how we compensate them, or all of that? Is that part of the international conversations?
I'll just say briefly, my biggest learning being at COP20 or whatever it was in Paris was the conversation was less about climate change and numbers than it was about fairness and justice and equitably addressing this challenge and providing resources for countries that need to invest for adaptation as well as mitigation, and where were those dollars going to come from. So it was really eye-opening to me to see how much it was not about just climate change, it was about those other impacts. Now, is it about emissions and other rare earths and all that? I don't know. Nora, do you know much about the COP28 and how it handled that?
Not specifically on that question. I mean, I will say, as Tim mentioned, right, there has been a huge focus at the international level and specifically at recent COPs around that issue of equity and who is paying for this transition, when we know it's just a very small handful of countries like the US that have contributed the majority of the emissions causing the climate impacts that we're experiencing. So I do know the next COP is actually going to, projected to focus explicitly on that kind of equity and investment conversation, the financing piece. And then I think going back to the Inflation Reduction Act and where these critical minerals are coming from, part of the administration's focus and actually work with the labor community was, how are we making sure that as we're incentivizing these technologies, we're doing everything we can to also incentivize the domestic manufacturing and production of these technologies, including EVs. So there are sideboards on the expanded incentives for electric vehicles that require a certain percentage of the parts and components of those vehicles to be produced in the United States. And that would apply to critical minerals. So Oregon has a pretty significant, by my understanding, like on a global scale, lithium deposit in the southeastern part of the state, right? So I think there's both, concerns, of course, right? What does that mean for environmental impacts and considerations? But also an opportunity to lead in terms of what does community input look like when it comes to mining of these minerals that the entire world is relying on, not just for EVs, but like also our phones. I think we don't talk about where these, I think to Tim's point, right? The fact that EVs are getting all this attention when these critical minerals are used across industries and technologies that folks rely on every day is telling. But anyway, so that gives us the chance to say, how are we utilizing community input into these projects? What environmental considerations are we applying to limit adverse consequences and impacts. So.
And cultural impacts as well, indigenous peoples in those locations and what's going to happen there, right? How do we minimize those or avoid those altogether? Which means that we probably need to invest even more to do it right. It's going to take a lot to achieve this.
So we are at time. I'm reminded of my late mother, who once said to me with a little smirk on her face, she goes, "I love that you guys call it sustainability. We used to just call it common sense." So I want to thank you for giving us a really good frame to think about some of these issues. Really, really fantastic. I love the way you interviewed each other and gave us some really good perspective on something that is both a local and a global issue. So thank you all. We will see you next week, and a big hand for our speakers.